This is a story about plants. It's a story that applies to all the many kinds of plants. Cultivated plants, as well as wild plants of every type. The story applies to green plants, those with chlorophyll, as well as to plants that have no chlorophyll. The story is plant reproduction. We'll find the simplest kinds of reproduction in the simplest plants. These algae are among the simplest plants. Let's look at some algae under a microscope. These are blue-green algae. Each is a separate one-celled plant. During reproduction, the living protoplasm of the plant pinches together until two separate plants are formed. We call this splitting fission or cell division. When these two plants are mature, they too can reproduce by fission. We call this kind of reproduction asexual reproduction. Is asexual reproduction limited to simple one-celled plants? This kind of alga, Edogonium, is made up of many cells, forming long filaments or strands. Each plant has specialized cells. For example, the plants are anchored in place by holdfast cells. Other cells are vegetative cells whose purpose is growth and food making. Some of the vegetative cells are converted into reproductive cells. Here, several reproductive cells are developing, ready to escape from the parent plant. The entire living matter of the cell, the protoplast, empties, escaping from the parent plant. We call this new plant a zoospore. Watch as it escapes from the parent plant. The zoospore moves to a different location where it may anchor itself. In time, each zoospore will grow to be identical with the parent plant. We have seen two examples of asexual reproduction, in a simple and in a more complex plant. In each example, there was only one parent. Reproduction was accomplished by the division of some of the living matter of the plant. And each new plant grew into an identical offspring of the parent. There is another way in which plants can reproduce. Here, in this Edogonium, the same kind of alga we saw before, we see what looks like a zoospore being formed. But this is the beginning of an egg cell, a female cell. In another filament are special sperm-producing cells which form tiny male or sperm cells. These smaller sperm cells are released and travel toward the egg cell. Watch as the smaller sperm enters an opening in the filament to fuse with the egg cell. This is fertilization, the fusion or union of one sperm cell and one egg cell. The fertilized egg is called a zygote. When ripe, it breaks off from the parent plant. Eventually, the zygote can germinate, grow into a new plant. The process we have seen is an example of sexual reproduction. So plants reproduce by asexual or sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction involves a division of protoplasm. Sexual reproduction involves a union of protoplasm. We can learn more about plant reproduction from flowers. Flowers have many forms. They may look like this, or this, or this. Yet in any flower, we can identify the reproductive organs. Let's look at this lily. Here are the stamens, the organs that produce pollen grains, which are tiny male plants. Here is the pistil, the organ which produces tiny female plants. Removing the stamens, we find that the pistil has a sticky surface at the top, the stigma. The stigma is supported on a long neck called the style above the ovary. If we take an ovary and slice it open, we discover several ovules, the beginnings of seeds. Within each ovule is a tiny female plant. At the top of the stamens are the anthers, or pollen sacs, supported on long filaments. In the anthers, pollen is produced. It comes off the anthers when touched. Pollen looks like very fine dust. But under the microscope, we see tiny grains. Here are the pollen grains from the hollyhock, the nasturtium, and the primrose. Each pollen grain is a male plant. When ripe, pollen grains fall from the anthers onto the stigma and adhere to its sticky surface. Within the pistil, the pollen grains begin to grow long extensions, pollen tubes. Each tube carries 2 male protoplasts at its end. The pollen tubes grow until one pollen tube penetrates an ovule, and one male protoplast fertilizes the female protoplast in the ovule to form the zygote. Within the ovule, the zygote grows into an embryo. In time, fertilized ovules may develop into seeds, each containing the embryo of a new plant. If we plant some seeds of the lily, and if conditions are favorable, new lily plants will grow. Let's remember that these new plants are the result of sexual reproduction. They are also an example of self-pollination, since the eggs were fertilized by pollen from the same flower. But in certain flowers, self-pollination is impossible. In this primrose, for example, the stamens are not tall enough to let pollen drop onto the stigma. Neither is self-pollination possible in such flowers that grow only stamens or flowers that produce only pistils. How is pollination accomplished in cases like these? We remember that microscopic pollen, like dust, is very light, and that the wind can carry it from flower to flower. Insects, too, when visiting flowers, may carry pollen grains from the stamens of one flower to the sticky stigma of another flower. And couldn't pollination be done artificially? Couldn't we transfer pollen from one flower to another, breed our own plants? Yes. By cross-pollination, we can crossbreed plants of the same species. Cross-pollination, a form of sexual reproduction, can result in a great variety of the same species of plant. Here, for instance, are differences in size and color in petunias. These characteristics are carried by the sexual cells and combined when flowers are cross-pollinated. For example, we might cross-pollinate the tall red petunia with the short white one. In this case, all the first offspring are red and tall, since red and tall are dominant characteristics. If 2 of these red and tall offspring are cross-pollinated, we get both red and white offspring. So, in sexual reproduction, offspring are not always identical with the parents. Could we select the particular characteristics we want? Yes. Scientists have learned by selective breeding to create new varieties of plants. Selective breeding is used in growing many domestic plants. These young men are cross-pollinating corn. They carefully collect pollen from one plant to fertilize the ovules of another plant. Once again, we are seeing an example of sexual reproduction in a plant. Reproduction that depends upon stamens and pistils. From the fertilized ovules, seeds will grow, seeds of corn. The ear at the left is a hybrid corn, the result of years of selective breeding. Not only better grains, but better fruits can be produced. However, many fruits and nuts do not reproduce easily from seeds. Suppose we wanted to reproduce a smooth-shelled walnut instead of a rough-shelled walnut. Stems from a tree having the characteristics we want are grafted into the trunk of another walnut tree. The grafted branches will grow and produce smooth-shelled walnuts identical to those of its parent. Many other plants reproduce similarly. A bud or eye cut from a potato tuber and planted will grow a new potato plant. We call this vegetative propagation, a form of asexual reproduction. In the same way, other important food plants, such as bananas, can be reproduced by propagation. By planting a part of the stem, banana trees can be grown identical with the original parent plant. Plant breeders are constantly experimenting to develop new and better varieties of plants by using the principles of plant reproduction. We have seen some of these principles. Asexual reproduction means the division of some of the protoplast in a single parent, producing offspring that are always identical to the parent plant. Sexual reproduction means the combination of two different kinds of cells, egg or female cells, and sperm or male cells. A combination of one egg cell and one sperm cell results in a fertilized egg that contains the embryo of a new plant. If different varieties of the same species are cross-pollinated, a combination of their characteristics will appear in the offspring. In sexual reproduction, offspring are not always identical with parents. We make use of this fact in selective breeding to create new varieties of plants. And by vegetative propagation, we can often ensure that our selection will continue to produce the offspring we want. Learning these few basic ideas about plant reproduction helps our understanding of plant life and, in turn, of other living things.